Since I moved to Berlin a few years ago, every family member who's come to visit me has been shocked by just how much of the country's incredibly dark history is on display in the streets. Beautiful is a word seldom used to describe the German capital. You can't walk more than a few minutes without literally stumbling upon a reminder of either the Berlin Wall, World War II, or more specifically, of course, the Holocaust. From monuments dedicated to LGBTQ and Romani victims of Hitler's regime, to the thousands of tiny copper plates known as stumbling stones on the sidewalk outside of buildings where Jews lived or worked when they were forcibly taken by the Nazis. And of course, the now iconic, eerie, unsettling memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, deliberately designed to convey a feeling of discomfort and confusion. It's clear Germany feels a responsibility to make amends and never forget the atrocities it inflicted upon the Jewish people. But the biggest monument to its immense national guilt nearly 80 years after the genocide of 6 million Jews is undeniably its unconditional support for the Israeli government. Of course, this comes in the form of yearly reparations payments and political support on the world stage, but also the stifling of any voices critical of the Jewish state, leading many to feel slogans like "never again" ring hollow as the government of Israel itself now stands accused of genocide against the Palestinian people at the International Court of Justice, and Germany announced it would speak in their defense. A quick note before we move on with the rest of the video. I shot all of this and tried to finish it before the ICJ announcement, but I'm a day late on that. Nothing I bring up in the video is affected by what the court announced, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of things about the decision. First, the ICJ ruled against Israel in that it imposed a bunch of provisional measures like doing anything in its power to prevent genocidal acts, prosecuting genocidal rhetoric, letting humanitarian aid into Gaza, and submitting a report to the ICJ within a month. But this is also being framed, dishonestly by some, as a victory for Israel in that the court didn't go as far as it could have gone, like imposing a full ceasefire in Gaza. However, even though the court did rule against Israel, this is just an initial emergency order. It's not a determination one way or the other on whether Israel is committing genocide. That determination is going to come way later after a longer investigation, and it's during that investigation that Germany is expected to speak on Israel's behalf. And now, on with the video. We'll get to Germany in the ICJ trial, so stick around for that, but just in case some of you have been living under a rock for the last 100 days, let's go over some of the basics for context. We're not going to go over decades of history, but suffice it to say, it didn't start on October 7th.
The Palestinian people have been subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation. They have seen their land steadily devoured by settlements and plagued by violence, their economy stifled, their people displaced, and their homes demolished. Their hopes for a political solution to their plight have been vanishing.
Since 2005, the Gaza Strip, which is this tiny, super densely populated piece of land, has been subjected to a near total blockade by Israel. And already at the time, many diplomats warned that Gaza would become an open-air prison, an expression you've probably heard since then because every major human rights group in the world says that's exactly what happened. Israel has been in control of Gaza's access to fuel, building supplies, medical supplies, but also water and food, which for a while they calculated based on the average number of calories the population would need to stay just above malnutrition levels. But the blockade failed to stop the violence, whether by the Israeli Defense Force shooting protesters demonstrating at the border, or Hamas and other militant groups kidnapping soldiers and civilians as well as launching rockets into nearby Israeli cities every few months. And while almost every single one of those rockets were intercepted by Israel's Iron Dome technology, the IDF consistently responded with bombing campaigns or large-scale assaults on Gaza, killing hundreds or thousands of Palestinians. Regardless of whether you rationalize the blockade of Gaza or the military occupation of the West Bank, which is a whole other topic, as justified measures to protect the Israeli people, it is an undeniable truth that the Palestinian people have been deprived of their human rights for generations, and their living conditions are among the worst on earth as a direct result of Israeli policies. But none of this, absolutely none of this, including the worst atrocities committed by Israel, justifies or excuses the actions of Hamas. I know social media likes to have clean good versus bad narratives, but Hamas is not a heroic resistance movement. It's a monstrous organization that's violently ruled over Gaza, routinely kidnapping, torturing, and killing not only Israeli soldiers and civilians, but also Palestinian political rivals and peaceful protesters in Gaza since their election victory in 2007, and they've refused to hold elections ever since. Defenders of Hamas often compare them to the ANC, which resorted to violence in its fight against the apartheid regime in South Africa, or to the IRA, which fought the British during the Troubles in Ireland, but Hamas has gone out of its way to deliberately target civilians, killing thousands since its creation. The high estimate for IRA civilian victims is 644, while the vast majority of their attacks targeted the military. And the ANC did kill mostly civilians, but in their case, mostly is a grand total of 52 people. Hamas has killed more civilians than both of those organizations combined during their entire lifetimes in a single attack on October 7th. They've also used child soldiers, are accused by Gaza residents of stealing and misappropriating humanitarian aid, and regularly launch rockets from near or even within the perimeter of schools, mosques, hospitals, and hotels, knowing perfectly well from experience that it won't deter Israel from striking their location, killing Palestinian civilians in the process. That doesn't absolve Israel of those deaths, but Hamas isn't innocent there either. So don't let anyone tell you that you can't support Palestinian human rights while also being critical of Hamas. And yet, despite all of that, considering the decades of ethnic cleansing, occupation, and blockades by Israel, and the fact that right now there's no peace plan or ongoing negotiations for one, Palestinians have no hope for the future, it is unsurprising and maybe even understandable that many in Palestine would support an organization as monstrous as Hamas. They're the enemy of their enemy. But to be clear, that doesn't mean everyone in Palestine or even in Gaza supports Hamas, nor does it mean, even if they did, that they should be treated as if they're members of Hamas. Non-combatants, regardless of their political opinions, are entitled to human rights and protections under the Geneva Convention, and that shouldn't be negotiable. And calling Hamas Israel's enemy, while true, misses an important aspect of the story. By Israeli officials' own admission, Hamas is an enemy of convenience. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and other officials have repeatedly expressed over the years just how much they believe Hamas is an asset to Israeli interests. They're an optical win to justify their actions against the Palestinians overall and to delegitimize the movement for a Palestinian state.
בהקשר הדה-לגיטימציה, חמאס הוא נכס והרשות היא נטל.
That is, until Hamas's attack on October 7th, the brutality of which goes far beyond anything they had done before, both in the scale and the nature of their atrocities. 3,000 Hamas fighters led a coordinated attack on border outposts before crossing into civilian areas and killing an estimated 1,139 people, over 750 of whom were civilians, including festival goers, tourists, regular families, and 36 children, as well as taking nearly 250 hostages back into Gaza. Look, I'm not going to go over the details of what Hamas did on that day, other than to say that even if you don't believe some of the more outlandish claims by Israeli officials that were proven to be dubious at best, the atrocities that were proven to be true, including in videos live-streamed by Hamas fighters during the attack, are absolutely horrendous and undeniably amount to war crimes. I can't even describe them to you here just on the off chance that this video doesn't get demonetized, which it almost definitely will. So I'm gonna need your help clicking the like button, subscribing, and sharing this video as widely as possible so that it doesn't get buried by the algorithm. And if you want to support the channel monetarily, the best way to do that is on Patreon, and the link for that is down below. I'll be super honest with you. Over the years, I've written a lot about clashes between Israel and Palestine, whether it was in Gaza, in the West Bank, in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, or at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Not as any kind of expert, but just as a staff writer giving news updates on Hamas firing rockets, or Israel destroying residential buildings, or news headquarters, or killing journalists like Shireen Abu Akleh. But mostly what I wrote about was the number of casualties on both sides. And day after day, the number of Palestinian dead was consistently at least 10 times higher than on the Israeli side. And the fact that the entire news industry kind of acts as if that's a normal state of affairs made me consider leaving journalism as a whole. And it's part of the reason why I made this channel, so I can be a bit more transparent and human in the way I talk about the news. So when I heard about what happened on October 7th, my first thought was about the just nightmarish last moments of people who were just enjoying a music festival, or the way people were hiding in their basement as Hamas fighters went door to door killing everyone. My second thought, though, was about that 10-to-1 ratio in the number of dead every single time. And like everyone else, I thought, with 1,000 dead on the Israeli side, this is going to be a bloodbath. So while it's absolutely true that in the first days after October 7th, some of the protests were disgusting, like in Sydney, where they chanted "Gas the Jews," or a mob at a Russian airport looking for Jewish passengers from a plane that had just landed from Tel Aviv. But the vast majority of those who took to the streets in the initial days after the attack did so because they were worried, correctly so, about Israel's response. And even long-standing supporters of Israel, like Joe Biden, knew exactly what was going to happen, which is why in his first speech after October 7th, he urged Netanyahu to show restraint.
While you feel that rage, don't be consumed by it. After 9/11, we were enraged in the United States. While we sought justice and got justice, we also made mistakes.
But the government here in Berlin and in other European cities thought it looked really bad to have pro-Palestine demonstrations so soon after such an attack against Israel. And it's here in Zonnenallee that the first unauthorized gatherings in support of Palestine were immediately met with police violence.
A guy standing next to me, not really next to me, but a bit away, and was holding a Palestinian flag. He was beaten brutally next to me, or wearing keffiyeh or whatever. So, and I saw it also in demonstration. People are just, being taken.
You had groupings of police people, stopping other smaller groups, telling them, you're not supposed to be here, you're wearing the scarf, you have a flag, you have this, you have that. One guy was just a friendly guy, I didn't know him. He was just wearing a hat. On the hat there was a knitted picture of a Palestinian person, and he got arrested right there and there.
Right here in this place, like maybe 200 meters from here, when the October 7th started, we were protesting here, and then came the police. So we were not allowed by the law to protest and even to raise the Palestinian flag. Too many people, young as me and maybe women as well, get arrested.
They were willing in Zonnenallee, in Neukölln. I mean, many. I saw scenes from there. It was things I know from the West Bank. The police were arresting children. This is something we didn't see in Germany until now. It's not known to me, at least until now.
By late October, as the death toll from the Israeli retaliation in Gaza reached 7,000, Berlin finally allowed pro-Palestine demonstrations to take place under heavy police presence. But it's important to acknowledge that the protests are not a monolith. Most were marching for human rights, but among them were, yes, some people who endorsed some pretty dicey ideologies. Footage from a protest in Essen went viral when a group of demonstrators were seen marching with jihadist flags. And there was a rise in anti-Semitic violence following October 7th, including Molotov cocktails thrown at this Jewish community center, hence the added security. So it's understandable that police would be more than a little jumpy about anti-Semitism, but they started to implement incredibly broad rules when it comes to what could and couldn't be said at the protest, to the point where criticism of Israel was considered anti-Semitic.
The police said, yeah, you're allowed to protest. That was 4 days after at Potsdamer Platz on the 15th. They said, you're allowed to protest if you don't chant, right, you don't say anything, and the Palestine flag is forbidden. That was on that day.
The police came in the middle of the demonstration and said, it's not allowed to call out, stop the genocide. And I was standing with the sign saying, stop the genocide. Then they came to me and to a man standing next to me, and he had a sign saying, solidarity with Israel equals stop the genocide. They took us. We were both detained separately again, and we are charged now with a hate speech, which is also ridiculous because it's not that we were calling to do a genocide. We said, stop the genocide. You're not allowed to say from the river to the seas, for example, all that.
Let's talk about that slogan. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. It's been a rallying cry for the pro-Palestine movement for a long time now, and obviously it means different things to different people, with the more radical anti-Israel activists meaning it as a call for the dismantling of the state of Israel, while others see it as a call for a one-state solution, meaning Israelis and Palestinians coexisting with equal rights in one country. And many see it as simply supporting Palestinians having freedom and human rights regardless of the details of how it's implemented. And 2 German courts have ruled that neither From the River to the Sea nor Stop the Genocide constitute hate speech, speech, though protesters continue to be arrested for that, just less consistently. But the German government and media have conflated any pro-Palestinian sentiment and criticism of Israel as being inherently anti-Semitic and hateful, even though many Jewish activists say Israel doesn't represent them.
They try to frame these protests as a security event. So if you see it on German TV, you will see how the police, the journalist will show you how the police is preparing for the demonstration. They will talk to policemen, then they will show some hysterical Arabic women or Arabic looking like women who are shouting, and yelling. This is the hysterical women. They will never show Jews. They don't want Jews and Jewish signs in this demonstration, because then they can claim it's anti-Semitic.
You will see a lot of these pictures of this Essen movement protest in the media, because that's what gives them the reasoning to block every other protest. The police always keep their own right to determine what's anti-Semitism, and it's usually just Palestine, anything related to Palestine. It can be the flag, the scarf. The police approached you usually, I would say, because of the way you look. Like, people who obviously looked Arab were stopped before even getting to the place,
And this focus on Palestinian and Arab protesters as being the drivers of anti-Semitism is interesting, because Germany does have an anti-Semitism problem in its far right. And the German far right supports the state of Israel. They just don't want Jews here in Germany. So conflating criticism of the state of Israel with anti-Semitism is doubly ineffective, because while there is some overlap there, one, you can clearly be critical of Israel without being anti-Semitic, and two, there are plenty of anti-Semites in Germany who are fully supportive of the state of Israel.
Let's just say there's a stereotype about the world knowing how Germans, the Germans think, what's important for the Germans, and what they did in the past. So if a German says someone's anti-Semitic, for a lot of people who are not associated with Germany, it sounds funny, really. Like, they're the ones who are telling Jewish people in Germany that they're being anti-Semitic. I'm not even able to explain how silly that is most of the time.
The German media was always propagating that the problem is that Muslims are anti-Semitic and they want to hurt Jews, and many pro-Israeli circles were propagating also this idea.
It's a very easily weaponized term to say, yeah, you're anti-Semitic, and it's easily applied on the Palestinian cause because of the history of it, because how long the Palestinians have been undermined.
The reality is we don't have any problem with the Jew people. This is the reality is. Our situation is political situation, it's political conflict, and we have only problem with the occupation of Palestinian territory.
That's not what people want. They don't want to replace an ethnic, racist, religious state with another one, even if it is closer to their, understanding or ideology. It's because a lot of us just want peace, man. We just want, equal rights.
The ones who are dangerous for us are the Nazis. I mean, they went to do the terror attacks in Halle, in Hanau. They are the NSU, this Nazi underground. In the police, for example, in the army, we are talking about white Germans who are Nazis or neo-Nazis.
By December, as the death toll in Gaza was in the tens of thousands, while German officials were shooting down calls for a ceasefire and voicing their continued support for Israel's operation, the German state of Saxony-Anhalt introduced a resolution forcing anyone applying for German citizenship in the state to declare in writing that they, quote, recognize Israel's right to exist and condemn any efforts directed against the existence of the state of Israel. Now, you may think that's a reasonable sentiment. I'd hope no one applying for citizenship anywhere would support efforts directed against the existence of any country, but even though Germany officially supports a two-state solution in Israel, it doesn't ask anyone to declare in writing any kind of support for a Palestinian state or for the rights of the Palestinian people. And this was explained as a measure against anti-Semitism, but it has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. They could have easily phrased this to be about the Jewish people and the recognition of their rights and a stance against their persecution. They chose to make this about Israel, a country that is currently accused of genocide. And yes, we will still get to those accusations, but this is really emblematic of the German position that a lot of Jews are critical of, which is the idea that the state of Israel represents all Jews, and therefore criticism of the state of Israel is an attack on the Jewish people. And by extension, support for Palestine, unless it's in the narrow framework that Israel tolerates, is also anti-Semitic. And this is a really common policy. It's the reason why the BDS movement is sanctioned in a lot of countries, including the US and Germany, and French lawmakers introduced a bill criminalizing anti-Zionism, and this could mean that if the bill passes, it would be illegal in France to criticize the state of Israel, or in some cases, the government of Israel. But when it comes to that citizenship measure, imagine a Palestinian refugee who's been living in Germany for a long time applying for citizenship. Maybe they've lost a home to illegal settlers backed by the Israeli government, or family members of theirs, innocent civilians, died in IDF bombings, and they're asked to declare loyalty to the country responsible for that. And if they feel uncomfortable with that declaration, they're considered unworthy of German citizenship.
It's something I can't understand it, you know. It's just like, I think you are forced. You don't have any right to say your opinion about something like this. In your heart, you are not accepting that. I know, like everyone is, like you can't force people only to sign like piece of paper that you have to ensure the Israeli security. For this interview, I asked a friend of mine, she came from Gaza, she's from Gaza, would you like to participate with this interview? And she said to me, I applied for the German citizenship, and I'm really like afraid that if anyone see this interview, so they will not like accept my German citizenship.
Now, that citizenship measure is only in one German state, and it's definitely going to be challenged in court. But there's been a broader climate of silencing voices supporting Palestine or criticizing Israel, including artists, writers, and photographers being disinvited from various events, having award nominations withdrawn, and photography exhibitions with no political messaging cancelled, and more, including the Jewish Museum firing an employee for describing the situation in the West Bank as apartheid. So let's talk about the apartheid thing. Now, there's an interesting parallel where accusations of genocide and apartheid are both dismissed by Israel and its supporters as preposterous, inflammatory, and anti-Semitic. But to date, 7 UN human rights experts, multiple UN committees, as well as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, dozens of Israeli NGOs and human rights groups, a former head of the Mossad, and more than 1,000 academics in Israel, the United States, Canada, and elsewhere, without even mentioning Palestinian human rights groups, all agree with the characterization of Israel as an apartheid state. And if that accusation was as ridiculous as supporters of Israel would have you believe, South Africa, the country where the concept of apartheid originated, would be the first to dismiss it as diminishing their own historical suffering. So it's not a coincidence that South Africa is the country to bring forth the accusations of genocide against Israel. Symbolically, this is also a validation of the apartheid accusations. Now, I don't know if what's happening in Gaza is a genocide. Honestly, I'm not qualified to make that call. And I know there's a lot of takes flying around in the media and on social media. Your favorite influencer, unless they have a background in international law, they're not qualified to make that call either. Ultimately, it'll be up to the International Court of Justice. And while there's an emergency ruling expected to come any day now, it might have come by the time I publish this video, the overall procedure is going to take years before they come to a final determination, so keep that in mind. What I can tell you for sure is that if the case for genocide was as preposterous and without merit as some say it is,
meritless, counterproductive, and completely without any basis in fact whatsoever,
there wouldn't be an open letter signed by nearly 900 scholars and practitioners of international law, conflict studies, and genocide studies from around the world calling it a genocide. Nor would 15 UN special rapporteurs and 21 members of UN working groups have come to the same conclusion. At this point, the death toll in Gaza is well above 20,000, with 70% of them being women and children. And that's not to say that the lives of the men who died were any less valuable, but at the very least, we know for a fact that the vast majority of those women and children were definitely not Hamas fighters. 85% of Gaza's population, nearly 2 million people, have been internally displaced. Most of them have lost their homes, and hundreds of thousands of them are currently starving. Virtually no one in Gaza has access to clean drinking water, and many are resorting to drinking seawater. And breastfeeding mothers are not getting enough drinking water to feed their infant children. There are basically no more functioning hospitals in the Strip, and medical supplies are gone. Doctors are amputating people without anesthesia, and they're performing surgeries by the lights of their smartphones. Of course, things are this bad because of the blockade. The people of Gaza have nowhere to go. They're stuck. There are no safe zones, and even refugee camps are being bombed, while almost no humanitarian supplies are being let in. Israel's defense to those facts is that they have a right to defend themselves after October 7th, and unfortunately, war always affects civilian populations despite their best efforts. But of course, it's hard for them to argue that they didn't intend to affect the civilian population when their defense minister, Yoav Gallant, said this.
אנחנו מטילים מצור מוחלט על העיר עזה. אין חשמל, אין מזון, אין מים, אין דלק. הכל סגור. אנחנו נלחמים בחיות אדם.
When it comes to the behavior of IDF soldiers, I've seen dozens of witness accounts of unarmed Gaza civilians being executed point blank in cold blood. I don't have the resources to verify any of them. We can't know how many are true, but they're perfectly consistent with cases that were proven. Like when the IDF mistakenly killed 3 Israeli hostages. They were trying to surrender to Israeli forces, waving white flags. They were shirtless to show that they weren't armed or carrying bombs, and until proven otherwise, the most likely explanation, the only explanation that makes sense, is that they mistook them for surrendering Palestinians and killed them. In another case, Halach Reis was shot by a sniper while calmly walking along a designated evacuation route. She was holding the hand of her grandson, a small child who was holding a white flag with his other hand. They were in the middle of the street and clearly posed no threat when she was killed. I can't show you the video here, but I'll link it and others in the description. And you can say those actions are by individual soldiers either making mistakes or going too far, but their behavior is consistent with rhetoric coming from the top.
שחררתי את כל המעצורים. עזה לא תחזור להיות מה שהייתה, וחמאס לא יהיה. חסל את הכל.
When the IDF took over Al-Nasser Children's Hospital in northern Gaza, they forced the medical staff to leave despite their objections. They were objecting because 5 premature babies were in incubators and couldn't be moved. The IDF told the doctors the babies would be taken care of. But weeks later, when journalist Mohammed Balusha entered the now abandoned hospital, he found the babies dead, decomposing in their incubators. A few days later, he was shot by Israeli snipers while clearly wearing his press vest. Is that a coincidence? We'll never know. But to date, over 100 journalists have been killed in Gaza since October 7th, the most journalists ever killed in a single location in such a short amount of time. Most were Palestinians. Many were killed in targeted bombings in their cars or homes, and many more lost their families in targeted bombings as well. We'll also never know if it's a coincidence that while the UN has been critical of Israel for its actions during the war, more UN workers have been killed than in any other war in the organization's history. And Israeli officials have made it clear they do not see a meaningful difference between civilians and Hamas.
It's an entire nation out there that is responsible. It's not true. This rhetoric about civilians not aware, not involved, it's absolutely not true.
And they've repeatedly used dehumanizing or explicitly genocidal rhetoric.
זכור את אשר עשה לך עמלק, נצטווינו. אנו זוכרים ואנו נלחמים.
For reference, this is the relevant Bible passage. Now go, attack Amalek, and prescribe all that belongs to him. Spare no one, but kill alike men and women, infants and suckling. Maybe you didn't get that reference when you heard Netanyahu's quote. I certainly didn't, but IDF soldiers did, and this is how they reacted to it. Look, I'm barely scratching the surface when it comes to the realities on the ground and the rhetoric. There's a database of over 500 arguably genocidal quotes from Israeli government and military officials, legislators, journalists, and more. And I'll be including that in the description as well. Back in October, Israeli historian and Holocaust expert Raz Siegel described what's currently happening as a textbook case of genocide, saying, "Israel has been explicit about what it's carrying out in Gaza. Why isn't the world listening?" And some are listening. That's why there's so many people in the streets in an ongoing ICJ case. But the silence from the US and most European countries is deafening. And Germany believes none of this amounts to anything approaching genocide. And it's entirely possible, maybe even likely, that the court will issue a ruling that Israel's actions in Gaza do not rise to the level of genocide. But given how much of an effort Germany puts into remembering its history, you'd be forgiven for thinking that they would take a more cautious approach when there's a serious, credible case of genocide levied at an ally of theirs, and maybe stay out of it until the court comes to a determination. But the reality is, Germany has often been late to the party on human rights, even after World War II and the end of the Nazi regime. The Basic Law, Germany's constitution, has a section against any kind of racial or ethnic discrimination. And yet they supported the apartheid regime in South Africa until the very end. So what stands out to me is that when dozens of governments, thousands of credible experts, and millions of activists from all over the world stood up to warn against and try to prevent even the possibility of another genocide, not only was Germany not among them, but it took the side of the accused and actively tried to silence those who raised their voices. I hesitated for a really long time before I even decided to make this video, and I really did try to take a measured approach here. I think there are plenty of areas where people can reasonably disagree, but if you are justifying or rationalizing what's happening to over 2 million non-combatants, regardless of what you think of their political opinions, and I'm probably going to get hate from one side for criticizing Hamas and from the other side for basically everything else. But if you are within the realm of reasonable, even if you didn't agree with everything I said, but this video spoke to you at least to some extent, consider supporting the channel, because I really need it. Like I said before, like, share, comment, subscribe, but if you want to go further and support me financially, the best way to do that is on Patreon, patreon.com/barelyinformed, where you can also find bonus footage from the interviews that I do. And finally, join the Discord. There's a really cool community that's starting to form there, and you can also find the channel on Instagram and TikTok at @barelyinfo. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.